WKAR is supported by the MSU Research Foundation, bringing new innovations to the marketplace for global impact. Learn more at msufoundation.org.
Good evening, and welcome to Decoding Disinformation, AI and the Threat to Democracy. I'm Sean Turner, and I'll be your host for our discussion. Tonight, we delve into one of the most pressing issues facing not just our nation, but the world. As artificial intelligence evolves, so too does the ease with which disinformation can be created, amplified, and weaponized. With the 2024 elections just 40 days away, AI is reshaping the landscape of political influence, and not always for the better. In this live special, we'll speak with experts at the intersection of AI, disinformation, human behavior, and public policy. We'll hear from researchers, policymakers, and journalists who are working on the front lines of this digital battleground. But this conversation doesn't end with tonight's broadcast. After we go off the air, we'll continue the discussion online with an exclusive Q&A session streaming on the WKAR News YouTube channel. Join us there where you'll have the opportunity to ask our experts your own questions. What's at stake in this age of artificial intelligence is more than just information. It's the integrity of our democracy, the trust we place in our institutions, and the decisions we make as voters. The challenge is unprecedented, but tonight we begin decoding disinformation. In our first panel of the evening, we explore the definition of disinformation, how AI technology perpetuates the problem, and the influence this may have on human behavior. Joining me tonight are three of Michigan State University's experts on these subjects. We have Dustin Carnahan, Associate Professor of Communication, Dr. Maria Molina, Assistant Professor of Advertising and Public Relations, and Dr. Mohammed Qasimi, Assistant Professor of Computer Science. Welcome to you all. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Dustin, I want to start with you this evening. Part of the title of our program is disinformation. Disinformation is a term that we hear thrown around a lot, but there are other terms like misinformation that we hear as well. I think that it's fitting that we start tonight by providing some clarity as to what these terms are. So can you start us off by sort of telling us what's the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
Sure. So misinformation is kind of the broader category of statements that are untrue, verifiably false, unsubstantiated, or misleading. We share misinformation sometimes innocently. We're just having a conversation. We don't understand something. We think it's true. We share it with our friends or family members, sometimes online, sometimes in person. Disinformation, on the other hand, is strategic. It's something that's shared with a specific intent to try to achieve some objective. This is why we hear the term disinformation campaign quite frequently. Sometimes this is something that's being originated from a foreign actor who's trying to influence an election. Sometimes it's with the intent of trying to confuse or obscure the truth in some way. It has a specific strategic goal in mind.
There's another term that's often thrown around that is related to misinformation and disinformation. Fake news. So why don't we go ahead and cover that one before we move on?
Everybody likes to talk about fake news, right? So fake news was a term that was used about 15, 20 years ago to kind of characterize news stories that were produced, or not news stories, sorry, but stories that were produced to look like legitimate news articles, but were actually not. They were made up. They referred to events that didn't happen. However, about 10 years ago, this term was co-opted by some actors to try to point to any sort of information that was critical of them or harmful to them in some way. And so we don't see that phrase used as much in recent years, primarily because of the confusion about what's actually being referred to when we say fake news.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Mohammed, a lot of disinformation is created with artificial intelligence. And that's another term that's sort of scary to people. So can you sort of give us, and I know it's a broad term, but can you sort of give us a basic understanding of what we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence or machine intelligence?
Absolutely. You know, the word intelligence is in artificial intelligence. And when we think of a person that's intelligent, it's a person who can solve problems, right? And a variety of problems, or engage in creative activities. And so when we're speaking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about machines that can emulate those general purpose problem solving capabilities that we as human beings have to classify, things, in the case if you're a medical doctor, you look at all this complex information and assign a label. If you're a stock market expert, you can predict what the future will look like and kind of buy stocks accordingly. Or if you're a phenomenal teacher or artist, you can generate wonderful content. And so artificial intelligence is trying to get machines to emulate those problem-solving capabilities by looking at data, using reasoning techniques, and sometimes more structured representations of knowledge to help us achieve that emulation.
Yeah. So, Maria, let's bring these two concepts together. A lot of misinformation and disinformation happens in online posts and social media platforms. With that understanding of misinformation, disinformation, and artificial intelligence, can you tell us, is there a role for artificial intelligence to play in flagging information that may be inaccurate or misleading?
Yeah, so detection of misinformation by AI has been in our radar for a long time, and there are different approaches to do that. However, it is important to understand that it can be difficult to do, and the reason for that is because at least at the content level, when we think about creating this model, right, just as human beings, first we have to have an understanding of what is misinformation and what is real news. So we gather a huge corpus of data to represent these different classes with the attempt for the machine to be able to distinguish them. So it sounds easy, right? But then when you look at our information ecosystem, we don't only have misinformation and real news. We also have satire, we have opinion, we have a lot of different types of content. So that is where the trick comes into play, right? So how do we distinguish something that is misinformation versus, let's say, polarized content or satire content? So at the content level, some of these contents might have like very similar properties and characteristics that make it hard for the machine to actually be able to accomplish it entirely. But on the positive side, though, the machine can be faster than human. So a lot of the approaches sometimes take that human and AI collaboration, taking kind of the strengths of both to be able to accomplish it. But it is a hard task to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Dustin, you know, experts debate the degree to which disinformation and misinformation actually influences decision making. But when we think about it, we know that it's a problem that needs to be addressed. The most obvious way to address it is by correcting it. What does your research tell us about correcting disinformation and when and how to do that?
Yeah, so what we found rather consistently is that we are able to use fact-checking messages or other correction strategies rather effectively to change people's minds after they believe something to be false, even amongst the most steadfast of believers. A lot of this also involves the importance of getting in early. So once something is introduced into the environment and people start gravitating to it, talking about it, sharing it, the sooner the better. Because once it becomes ingrained in someone's mind, it's a lot harder to uproot that belief. So that's one of the strategies, is just early detection, figuring out when you need to get out there ahead of something. We also find that one-shot sorts of fact-checking messages aren't particularly effective for at least a very long time. But if we're able to consistently get the message in front of the right audiences, we find that those effects can be rather durable weeks, months later. Meaning that, again, it's not about just one time giving somebody a message and hoping that they're going to be forever cured of whatever belief that they had. It's reinforcing over time that this isn't right, this isn't correct, there is a truth and this isn't it. And if we can do that more and more, it does result in effects that generally are long-lasting and meaningful.
Yeah, great. You know, Mohammed, your research, your work is sort of at the intersection of the synergies between humans and machines. But when you take a step back and you think about powerful AI tools being in the hands of average Joes like me, is there cause for concern?
I think artificial intelligence is just an amplifier on who we are and what we can do. In the same way that a car extends our ability to move from point A to point B faster, we could do it with a horse and carriage before, we can do it faster in an automobile. Well, now if I want to generate a piece of content, I can use a large language model to do that. But even if I have an artificial intelligence tool help me create content, and that content could be disinformation, as you suggest, I still am the person who's making the conscientious decision to use that artificial intelligence to create that content and then ultimately to disseminate that to the world. So I think that the the way to think about artificial intelligence in this is as a tool that sort of allows the actor, the human agent, to sort of, I don't know, distribute or dispense with their intentions upon the world faster and more effectively. So that's good for people who want to use it for good things, and that's not so good for people who don't want to use it for good things.
Yeah. So Maria, let me ask you, when we think about artificial intelligence, it only works to the degree that people actually trust the AI. So what does your research tell us about the degree to which people feel confident that AI-generated content is something that they can trust?
So when we're thinking about AI-generated content, what our research has revealed is that people have different perceptions of AI that we call cognitive heuristics. So these are just rule of thumb that come up based on our observations, our experiences. And we all have those observations and experiences that makes us either trust or not trust the AI, right? And so what we find is that one is contextual. There are some contexts that people are more okay with AI being that source or that creator of content. So for example, stories about sports, right? But we also find that whenever contexts are a little bit more subjective, people sometimes don't trust it too much. And that's because the content, in that case, people perceive like it needs some of that subjectivity and contextualization that people can bring. And the same happens when we look at content moderation for AI. Right? We see that some people hold these heuristics of AI being very objective and accurate, and thus they believe it. But some other people might think, AI actually doesn't have that contextualization, so if you're telling me this is false, I might not trust it too much. And we find that there's different audience segments that have these heuristics. So for example, people who tend to distrust others actually tend to hold that heuristic of objectivity of AI. Thus, they trust it more than human. The same with political conservatives. We found that they actually tend to believe, comparison to human, AI can be more objective and accurate. But on the flip side, people who are more tech savvy or fear AI tend to have the heuristic of, AI lacks that contextualization, so they don't trust it as much as human. So to get back to the other question that you were asking, should we be using these tools for content moderation? That's yet another complexity, right? It depends on how people perceive that AI to begin with. Wow. So it's tricky.
Really interesting. Listen, you all have given us a lot to think about. Such an interesting discussion. Dustin, Maria, Mohammed, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We'll be back in a moment with our next panel, but first, we'll hear from CEO and Chief Strategist at Harbor Strategic Public Affairs, John Selleck, and CEO and Chairman of Grassroots Midwest, Adrian Hammond, about the impact of artificial intelligence on their work as they work as campaign consultants and public affairs experts for politicians.
I'd like to welcome to this segment my two major leaks in the Democratic caucus and the Attorney General's office. Not true. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Artificial intelligence, on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you that this is going to go sideways and really damage the political arena?
Well, I think it's a massive opportunity for chaos and distrust and discord, but it's also a massive opportunity for innovation and creativity and advancement. It can really go both ways. It probably will go both ways, but what we're already seeing in elections in other countries, like in the UK, they question whether some of the candidates even actually existed or whether they were created by AI to help boost vote share for burgeoning new parties. In Slovakia, they recorded a voice that sounded like the pro-Western candidate, making it sound like he was faking and stealing the election, and the pro-Kremlin candidate won instead. So it's already happening elsewhere. It's coming here.
All right, but on a scale of 1 to 10, in your private moments, where does it end up?
Well, for now, because the complete lack of regulation, the fact that the federal government was barely getting its act together, I just saw on the news on the way over here, Tim, the FCC is thinking about putting restrictions in on fake robocalls. So they're a little bit behind the ball. So, it's somewhere around a 7 as a problem right now, I think.
What's your number?
Oh, it's a 10. I'm making so much money off of this stuff right now. It's a 10. You should be alarmed. This is the regulatory regime that we have right now. John alluded to the fact that Washington is way behind the stick in terms of potential regulations here. Senator Klobuchar has got a couple of bipartisan bills in the Senate to potentially regulate some applications of AI. Part of the problem with those is that there are serious First Amendment concerns with that. Lies are protected by the First Amendment.
Well, that's the point. Okay, why are you making money off of this?
There are so many different applications for artificial intelligence in politics. I think the thing that right at the top of the list that worries people the most is just straight up fakes of things. We kind of saw this with the DeSantis campaign, where they recorded an ad with an AI of Trump's voice, saying something that Trump had said, but not they didn't have a recording of it, so they just made one up. John pointed to some examples from Europe that we've seen. That's just the fakes, to say nothing of the way that you can use AI tools to get incredibly invasive about mass quantities of information about millions and millions of people at once that you can analyze in a way that a human being never would. You can use that to target people. You can use that to create content that's meant to stimulate their particular brains. It's incredibly frightening.
What we had before are words. We have people putting false things in words on Facebook and that. Now videos and sound are coming out, to the extent that the fake audio of Joe Biden in the primary in New Hampshire this year that said, don't bother to come out and vote, just vote for me in the fall. It happened and everybody believed it. The DeSantis clip, that it was Trump's words, but they used AI to use Trump's voice to actually read it aloud because he hadn't actually done that, because his written stuff tends to be even more incendiary than his verbal stuff, so they added the verbal stuff to it. Nobody will ever know what's true or not, and unfortunately what I think will happen is people just come to accept that you can't trust any of it.
So have you had clients come to you asking to use AI?
Well, of course, they all want to know if it's available and is it usable. But let's look at the gray line where we talked about earlier, First Amendment rights. You referred to lies, but B-roll footage showing fake families having a happy time at the park as the background of a political ad, that's perfectly acceptable. Commercial advertising, the same thing. We don't think any of those moms and dads and kids that we're seeing buy those great products online are real. They're fake. And so why can't AI just make that?
All right, so if you have a client that comes to you and says somebody sent out a phony press release, you can't reach enough people to undo what's already been done. Yes or no?
That's absolutely correct.
So do you tell this client to go away, or do you still take their money?
It depends on the context and whether we think we can actually help them. You can't unring that bell, but depending on what their goals are, you may be able to do enough damage control for them to survive or still achieve their goals.
So there's even the opportunity, Tim, to make you, and essentially to the victim, where you flip the whole thing and bring more attention to yourself as the good guy who's being wronged. There's a lot of different strategies there.
Yes.
With media who gets snookered, and it's going to happen, it just is, we can go back to them and talk about them, and they'll do something different. They'll even bring up the fact that, something, devious is going on here. But because of social media, especially if it's advertised, is out there, that's the bell you can't unring.
That one, that's out of control, isn't it?
Yep.
If we didn't have social media, our lives would be better, right?
I mean, the owners of those social media companies seem to think so. It's why they largely don't let their children use them.
And on that ominous note, thank you for your expertise, and good to see both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, take care, guys.
For more from Adrian and John, you can see their full interview on WKAR.org or on the WKAR News YouTube channel. Our next conversation delves into what's happening on a state and local level to protect citizens from the harms of AI-generated misinformation. Joining me now is State Representative Penelope Cernoglu of House District 75 and State Representative Matthew Bierlein of House District 97. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So you co-sponsored a bipartisan bill that requires that any AI-generated political content be marked to show that it is AI-generated. Let me ask you, why did you think it was important to address this issue through legislation? Representative?
So I had been reading about it, and just reading that there was federal legislation introduced on this, and you're just kind of reading articles about AI, and I chair our elections committee in the House, so I'm always kind of like looking for things that are elections related. And then when I did more research on it, I saw that this was already happening, that AI was already being used in political ads and pictures just to make it look like things were happening that weren't actually hadn't happened. So then I kind of try to look for any groups that were working on it, and we did find one, but there's actually not like a lot out there yet, and they're increasing as we speak, but it's even though it's been around, it's kind of seen as a newer, field because it's growing so quickly. So we are, trying to, keep up and even get out ahead of it. And it turned out that Representative Bierlein had also already been working, on AI legislation, which was very similar to what I was working on, and then we just decided to, team up and do it together, because it's always great when you can find, a bipartisan area of agreement.
Yeah, so a true bipartisan sort of finding of common ground on this one.
It certainly was. I mean, I had started working on it. It was one of the first bills we started working on in my office. One of my young staff members came to me with an idea for some AI-related content. And I said, I don't know if that's the first thing I want to do, but let's see where else that could go. And we brought it to elections and thought, maybe even just a simple campaign finance violation. If you don't put the disclaimer on and you generated this with AI technology, then we're going to give you a campaign finance violation. And we had started to kind of shop that around for co-sponsorship and knew it was going to go to the elections committee. So started talking to Rep. Cerniglu, and she's like, I'm going to work on the same thing. Do you want to work together? I said, yeah, sure. Let's get that done.
Yeah. So this law is similar to a few in other states that clearly make progress in this area. But let me ask you, when you think about the larger picture of artificial intelligence and disinformation, do you think that there's more to do? And more importantly, when we think about who should be responsible for regulating and ensuring information integrity, should it be done in legislation, or should others be involved as well?
I tend to think that there's room for legislation to kind of set some boundaries, but it's kind of like any other technology. We talked about cars in the previous panel, getting you from point A to point B. Inventors are going to push boundaries. They're going to see how far they can take things because they want to see what they can use that for the good, and then people screw it up, right? So let's hold people accountable is kind of where I lean, but there's probably room for a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of kind of the platforms, like Google reached out to us, and anyone that could really, potentially be held responsible reached out to us, after the bills were introduced, because they just wanted to make sure that, basically that they wouldn't be held liable if they weren't trying to, promote this unknowingly. But what I learned, in those conversations was that a lot of them already have, precautions and policies, and they are trying to, find ways so that this doesn't end up getting pushed out, through their service. So it's kind of a combination, of both. Like there's a lot of different responsibilities, but since there's no, law, or there were no laws on it, for us, as lawmakers, it made sense, to put some regulations out there that so that people who were trying to intentionally mislead, would be held accountable for it.
So I want to switch to your districts. You obviously spend a lot of time out talking to voters, to constituents, and you sort of get a sense of what's on their minds. So as it relates to disinformation and the role that disinformation might play in this upcoming election, what are you hearing from your constituents? Are they unfazed? Are they concerned? Are they angry? What's the temperature out there in your districts?
So I think they are very concerned, and the more they hear about it, and they actually realize that AI can create things that look, sound, and sound like completely real, it really it scares them that they're seeing this, and they just don't know, and they ask questions like how do we know? What would we do? And how can we do more to ensure that it's not here? Because of course, it could be happening, and we aren't even spotting those particular videos or sound files. So I think people are concerned and just in general, because AI is new, it kind of raises
raises some questions. Yeah, Representative Bierlein?
Well, I think I'm getting, from what I've heard from constituents, people are doing a lot of information shopping. So we see something and maybe we don't know.
Yeah.
And so we start looking, well, I'm going to look on the news, or I'm going to look at this news source, and then I'm going to look at this news source. So maybe I looked at CNN, I looked at Fox, and I looked at the BBC, and then I came up with okay, that's what actually happened. But I think that the technology is pushing people to look for more information because they're just not satisfied with that one source as being the truth.
Yeah. Well, let's sort of broaden the picture here and ask, when you think about all of those people out there who are right now trying to find information to make informed decisions as they head to the ballot box here in a few weeks, do you think there are people out there who will go and cast their vote primarily based on disinformation?
I would say, yes. Yes, I think people will. I would like to say no, that they'll all go ahead and do their research, but I think a lot of people, they read what's mailed to them, they watch what's, shown on the TV, and if it's said enough times, they'll believe it. So, the best we can, do is try to put correct information out there.
Yeah,
I would agree, and I think it's going to be a mix of. It doesn't matter if it's going to be disinformation, misinformation, or true information. They're going to go and they're going to vote based on what their worldview is with that information, and so that true information may be perfect for them, or the misinformation may reaffirm a belief, or the disinformation may, double down on that. Hey, I already thought this about that person, so now I really know, and I'm going to go vote that way.
Yeah. And we just have to hope that people do exactly what you said and spend some time seeking information and really working to get to the truth. This conversation went fast. There's so much more to talk about. Representative Bierlein, Representative Sernoglu, thank you so much for being here. This is really great information. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Our conversation continues in a moment, but first, we talked with Don Gagné, national political correspondent with NPR News, to gain insights into reporting in an age of disinformation.
My name is Don Gagné, and I am a national political correspondent for National Public Radio, NPR News. Over the course of my career, it's quite astounding when you think of how journalism has changed. The basics are still the same, right? You still want to get the story, you still want to work your sources, you want to find reliable sources, you want to give an objective rendering of whatever tale it is you're trying to tell. But the way we tell stories has changed. Public perceptions of what news is has changed. Public expectations as to what a story should be has changed. These are all things that we try to contend with, that we need to contend with, but I hope always keeping the focus on that same kind of core objectivity, find the facts, try to understand what is happening, try to share it as cleanly and as efficiently as you can so the audience can grasp it in whatever way they are now receiving it. The rise of AI in the form that we have it today, and recognizing that the technology is advancing, minute by minute, I guess, just means we build in these checks and balances where we don't take anything that we see, unless we literally saw the live event with our own eyes, at face value. So we as a news organization, we as journalists, need to make sure that we have systems in place that can deal with this, because what is ultimately is at stake is public trust. I mean, do they trust that what we have is real? The public perception of journalism is always kind of shifting kind of in reaction to real-time events, in reaction to technology, and in reaction to any number of things, right? Even in this election, we're covering the 2024 election as we speak, there have been pretty big stories about the size of crowds at events. Former President Trump has alleged that a crowd seen in photographs of a Kamala Harris rally was not as big as the campaign maintained it was because it was AI. Now, photographers who took the images and TV camera people who covered that event quickly came forward and said, these are my pictures, these are accurate, these weren't manipulated. But it gets the accusation out there into the bloodstream, right? And all of that can just erode trust broadly. And all of that is an issue, but it also just clearly demonstrates that AI was not used in this case, but people were accused of using it. And suddenly there's a debate. Did they or didn't they? And there will be people, for political reasons, they're happy to believe the falsehood if it supports their political view and gives them a talking point. Not on television or anything, but just like with their friends and with their family. And it kind of ripples through society in that way. What is my hope for journalism moving forward? I mean, I would, not to sound too naive here, but my main hope would be that it be used for good and not to mislead people, right? And that sounds corny, even as I say it, because technology will be used all sorts of ways if it's available. But I would hope that we have the tools to make sure we know what AI is. We can identify when it is being used in a way that does not support journalistic standards, that is there to perhaps undermine them, because ultimately the thing that hangs in the balance here is public trust in what we do.
As we navigate the age of disinformation, journalists face unprecedented challenges. At a time when it's difficult to trust what we see and hear online, the role of trustworthy journalism has never been more important or more complicated. Tonight, we're joined by journalists to discuss how they are adjusting to shifting perceptions of the media that are continuing to shape national conversations. Here with me is Jam Sardar, news director at WLNS, and Mike Wilkinson, data reporter with Bridge, Michigan. Thank you both for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mike, I want to start with you. You know, right now there are millions of people out there who are working hard to find the news and information that they need to make an informed decision coming into this next election. And if you were to ask them, is there a role for artificial intelligence to play in journalism? Many of them would probably say no. But you've been working in this field for a long time, and you have found ways that artificial intelligence can support journalists and journalism in ways that don't compromise journalistic value. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And one thing that Adrian Heeman mentioned in his conversation politically was the ability to analyze millions of records. Now, in that case, was allowing people to target people for elections, but those same skills and benefits accrue to us as well. If, personally, I have hundreds of pages of court records. I can't connect one record to another. I can put it in Google Pinpoint, and it will give me an index of every name in there. And if I want to find something from Sean in there, I can find it. And I just couldn't, I'd have to, in the past, I'd have to just remember it all or do my own indexing. So it's a tool that allows me to do my job better. If I heard that there was a school board meeting in, Hazlitt, and they talked about, you're not going to believe what they talked about, and there was an audio recording of it, I could throw into an AI, and it would find for me where I wanted to go. I would still have to watch it and listen to it and then report on it and talk talk to the people, but I could find it so much quicker than I could myself. I mean, I'd just sit there for 2 or 3 hours on YouTube, or wait a month and a half for the minutes. So it's a tool that if used correctly, can make our work so much more vibrant and effective. I personally use it a lot when I'm just trying to write code. It's teaching me how to write code, and it's not affecting what I'm doing in terms of negative. It's making it better, it's enhancing it, it's giving me more analytical ability. So those are the good things, of course.
Yeah, yeah. And I do want to talk about some of the more challenging aspects of artificial intelligence as well.
There were some references, the legislators before, when you're hopeful that someone sees something and they're going to go to 3 other sources to kind of verify it. My fear is that headline from usnews.whatever.com, which you're going, I'm not sure that's correct, but it looked just like that other publication that I believe. My fear is that not enough people will kick the tires and go look, and they might make a decision. There might be the confirmation bias that they talked about, where that's what I believed anyways, and that's the part where I get a little scared. We can put journalists can put their fingers in the dike of when there's one hole, but when there's a million and they're all coming at you and they all are the same size and the water's pouring out, that's the part that scares me.
I wish we were all informed and media literate, but going to 5 different sources to find the truth, as they say, ain't nobody got time for that. So we do it because we're in this business, but that's one of the many things we have to worry about. People going to news sources that reinforce their worldview, as someone said before, and not necessarily the truth.
Yeah, and would you agree that oftentimes, even for people who just are looking for the truth, the time and patience and ability to discern that when you've looked at so many different sources, is still oftentimes not there, right? Because you simply don't know what you're looking at.
And there's so many shiny objects out there where the truth might not be as sexy, or when I can create a video that a lot of people are going to watch, doesn't mean it's true. And it'll be a lot less interesting than the thing that actually happened.
Jim, right now there are, as I said, lots of people out there who are trying to get informed, and there are so many polls and studies out there that talk about trust in the media. And oftentimes, what's perceived as a lack of trust or low trust in the media is related to perceptions of disinformation, misinformation. But there is a bright spot. People tend to trust their local media. You are a local journalist. You've been a local journalist for a long time. Talk to us a little bit about why people tend to trust local media.
Sure. I think, back in the day, there were basically 4 sources of news: ABC, NBC, CBS, and the paper. We've been around for a long time. We have the trust that we've earned over the years. In my station's case, 75 years. And we have staff and anchors. One of my main anchors has been with us for more than 30 years. People know her, people trust her, and she's also the person that you might bump into at the grocery store, unlike the people who are at the anchors of the CBS Nightly News or on CNN or Fox News. And I think we've been entrusted with that legacy, and I think that has a lot to do with why people continue to trust us.
Right. Mike, I want to go back to you because reporters gather information, they look at issues from multiple angles, and they write stories. But as you alluded to earlier, that's not the only source of news and information. Artificial intelligence also gathers information and puts it together in ways that look like journalism. Talk to us about that and whether that's something people should be concerned about.
Well, I think one of the things that I've experienced is when I look at my phone and my news, and more, it's just things are being thrown at me that, again, look like news that I know are picked up on from something I Googled a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and AI, it's either AI generated or the algorithm, which is a kind of intelligence, thinks is what I'm going to want as news. And it's not. It's not. What I'm finding is I want a gatekeeper, a human gatekeeper, and I'm not so sure everyone wants that. I hope we will all get to that. That we want someone that we can trust, because the point you want, we might trust the local anchor. I think enough people are going to start seeing, wait, why are all these stories popping up in my feed? And I hope that they come to the same conclusion that they're getting fooled to an extent. I mentioned to you before, I was kind of frightened. I was in Chicago recently, and I was riding the train, and I just watched people on their phones the way they consumed. And they weren't being discerning, right? They weren't all reading the Washington Post or the New York Times or even the Chicago Tribune. They were just laughing at one video from Instagram or TikTok at a time, and this wasn't kids; these were adults. So that's what I fear, is that the disinformation actor could just absolutely play upon them and create just completely false impressions of the world we live.
Yeah. Let me just ask both of you here. You're both in the journalism field. For all those people out there right now who are saying, so what do I do? In a few words, what's your advice to people who really do just truly want to be informed and be able to make good decisions based on legitimate information? Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, one thing I do is I'm trying to limit those feeds. I'm trying to knock out as best I can all those things that I think are wrong. I mean, on your phone, you can just click and I don't want to see anything from Homes and Garden whatever, because one time you decided to look for a bath rack at some point. I think you've got to be a little discerning in that regard. And then when you're just having fun on TikTok or Instagram or wherever, you just have to bring a little more discernment to what you're getting. Is this a bot? And is it confirming my bias? Or wait a minute, maybe I should kick the tires. But there are a lot of things you can do, but whether people will do it, that's I don't know.
No, thank you. Jam, unfortunately, we're out of time, but listen, I want to thank both of you for being here. This was a great discussion. There's so much more to talk about, but you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
All right, in a moment, we'll turn to the future to discuss what's next for AI and the impact it has on the spread of disinformation. But first, WKAR's policy and politics and civics reporter Arjun Tucker took to the MSU campus to hear what students have to say about artificial intelligence.
I'm Arjun Tucker. I'm WKAR's politics and civics reporter, and we're here on the campus of Michigan State University speaking with students about artificial intelligence, disinformation, and their thoughts on how AI could impact the 2024 election and future elections. And here's what they said.
I haven't really used it before. I don't know too much about it.
I have experience with it, ChatGPT.
So I used the ChatGPT.
ChatGPT. I've used ChatGPT before.
I use it mainly for translation, since my mother tongue is not English.
One for classes, not cheating.
I try not to dabble too much in it because there's a line that you can cross, and I don't want to cross that. There's been an influx of regulations that you shouldn't be using ChatGPT or other forms of AI to write your papers. They want to try and have it of your own original thoughts.
With AI, there's a big discussion with disinformation. Have you encountered AI disinformation online?
And I've definitely seen the AI pictures, but I'm fairly savvy when it comes to seeing those things. It's when someone has 6 fingers.
It's just fake pictures and stuff. I see photos that AI has created, and obviously I can tell that it's fake.
It definitely can be a source of disinformation. It's a man-made object, it's going to have its faults. It's controlled by somebody, so it could be, prone to bias. So we need to be careful about, the things that you use and where you get your information from.
A lot of what is circulated with AI, it's definitely put there from people who are trying to infiltrate an idea within the country. Whether that comes from a different country or the people within it, I'm not sure.
I am from Ukraine, so we deal a lot of misinformation from Russia, and Russia has a lot of influence and using misinformation, spreading the false about war in Ukraine. I think globally that it became easier to create false messages and to spread disinformation and misinformation. For example, if a human can make one text or one campaign, artificial intelligence can make 100 posts or 100 stuff at the time. So I think people should lean more into critically thinking.
What impact do you think disinformation and AI might have as we're heading into the 2024 election?
Yeah, I think it can definitely get people to vote a certain way, towards the left for sure.
I definitely think that it can have some effect, but there will be effect on both of the big sides. So I don't think that trying to pull people one way or another will have that great of an impact.
There's a lot of, people who are really, left wing and, people who are really right wing, with their ways of thinking. And, you just got to be set in your own ways and just be mindful of the things that you watch. Have discernment.
Well, it's certainly not going to help trusting the government. I also feel like potentially as it becomes more, like AI becomes bigger and bigger and harder to tell what's real or not, I feel like more people become less trusting of anything on the internet, and they'll become more like they'll have to see things for themselves before they really believe it.
Artificial intelligence can generate some opinions that are quite extreme. That's gonna be like the left person because even more left, and the right person become more right, and that's gonna hinder the public discourse or the fair exchange of opinions.
I think it will have really a big impact and bad one on the elections, because many politicians who are not very trustworthy can engage people in bad choices, and artificial intelligence can empower. I hope that American people, as people who really build the strongest democracy in the world, will make the right choice on the elections.
We've heard a number of perspectives on what impact AI might have on this election season. But what comes next? I'd like to welcome Tien-An Huang, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and welcome back Dustin Carnahan and Mohammed Ghassemi to talk to us about how AI is being implemented in communities and how it will continue to evolve in the years to come. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Tien-An, I want to start with you. When we think about how AI has been used in communities across the country, there are a lot of positive things that researchers and innovators are doing. You've been working with something called ShotSpot. Just as an example of how AI is being applied, can you talk to us a little about what that is and what the implications are?
Yeah, sure. So I sort of think about sort of police technology and sort of surveillance sort of broadly speaking. So ShotSpotter is one of them. It's what we call an acoustic gunshot detection system. So if a gunshot goes off, there's some mics around the area, and they will sort of pick up a sound and sort of identify that sound as a gunshot, and maybe as opposed to like a firework or a car backfiring. And that usually alerts sort of the police, and then they'll dispatch, some police officers to the area. Previously, there are other things like predictive policing. These sort of systems. There's also acoustic. Sorry, not that one. The sort of license plate readers and these sorts of things, and facial recognition technology. These are all things that,
you mentioned police surveillance, so let's expand that out a little bit. When people think about police surveillance and the use of artificial intelligence in that space, it's something that might make people a little nervous. So, can you talk about sort of how artificial intelligence is used, and what kind of constraints should be on AI as it relates to things like police surveillance?
Yeah, so there's actually a really nice framing that there was a Wired article that described this sort of the parent company of ShotSpotter, which is SoundThinking, as trying to be the Google of police tech. So and I think that's a really nice way to think about it, because if you think of what Google started off as, it was just a search engine, right, back in the day, and now it's everywhere. It's doing everything, right? It's they're trying to sort of do lots of things at the same time. And so when we talk about AI and sort of police tech and just other things too, but each one of these things, it's a single use purpose, right? But when we put them together, it's something that's sort of much more generalized, and that's something that people are thinking about, and we don't quite know what that looks like yet.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I want to fast forward here just a little bit. We've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence and its implications, but let's look at 5 to 10 years down the road here, maybe a little further. How do you think our lives might be impacted, changed? What is it that we're doing today that will be different in 10 years directly related to artificial intelligence? Mohammed, let's start with you.
I think as it becomes easier to automate activities, and get through kind of the technical pieces to accomplish what we're looking to do, there's going to be a greater emphasis on person-to-person interaction. We heard allusions to this actually with earlier folks that you were speaking with. If you're confronted with information from a variety of sources, because it's easy to fabricate, then you start to lean into either trusting your own biases if you're getting that information digitally, or relying more on interpersonal interactions. And I think that that's an opportunity in one sense, because sort of the digital ecosystem, the profusion of knowledge that AI allows, makes us kind of rely back on interpersonal relationships as a way to get reliable information in the future. But it also poses an important challenge, because that's not scalable, right? I mean, you can't scale having conversations with people all over the country, at least not in a face-to-face capacity. So there's interesting challenges and opportunities that I think will exist that the technology is allowing.
Yeah, let's focus for a minute, Dustin, on some of those challenges. When you think about artificial intelligence, we clearly have established tonight that there are positive applications, but what are some of the things that concern you with regard to the prevalence and spread of artificial intelligence?
Well, one thing that concerns me is what my colleague here just said, right? And that is that our inability to rely as much on indirect experience as we used to. And what I mean by indirect experience is secondhand accounts of things that happen, right? I totally love the idea that we'll be able to communicate more person to person and have these conversations to help validate what's real and what's not. But at the same time, there's many instances in our lives where we don't have the opportunity or perhaps even the will to experience things directly. We simply can't, right? To the point of it being scalable. For example, we can't go to political rallies, and if we do, we choose to go to those that are already coming from our preferred candidate. And so, how do we grapple with that sort of situation? How do we actually feel comfortable about what we're seeing and whether or not we can believe it, and kind of pushing in that same direction? I think another challenge is how can we engage in media literacy training in an increasingly confusing media environment? How can we make people recognize the concerns involving AI while simultaneously not making them doubtful of everything? Because I think if we enter that state, similar to what an earlier panelist said, if we enter that state, I think we're in a really precarious situation in terms of our ability to just know what we can trust. And if we don't trust anything, well, then how can we participate meaningfully? And I think that's a real challenge moving forward.
Let me shift to a question that really sort of gets to something I know a lot of people are confused about, and that's sort of the issue of how AI works. There's a belief that that if you have artificial intelligence, that the longer it gets to linger, the smarter it gets, and there's fear that at some point it gets smarter than us and it takes us over. So I want you all to talk a little bit about that fear, that concern, and sort of how artificial intelligence becomes more intelligent. Right? So Mohammed, let's start with you, and then Tien will talk with you.
Sure. Yeah. The way that contemporary AI systems are trained is by using very large collections of data. If you think about language models, think your ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude 3, or that flavor or family of models that we've all got increasing experience with. They look at data that comes from the internet, from textbooks, from journalists, and so on. And they're trying to figure out what are the patterns that are embedded within there? When a given question is asked on Reddit, what does a typical response pattern look like? That's a kind of a fuzzy way to understand how it is that the models are developed and trained. The implications to that are important, they're great on the one hand, are that those AI systems are good at kind of thinking through and acting in domains where there's been a lot of discourse, where there's been a lot of discussion. They're not as capable in really frontier domains, right? Because we don't have a lot of public-facing writing on those things. They're also not really great at topics that require certain kinds of reasoning. Inference, or trying to predict what's likely based on what they've seen in the past, they're great at. If you ask it to write an essay, for example, a language model on COVID-19, there's been a lot written about COVID-19. So it's going to nail it. It's going to do a great job. If you start asking it to write about a very obscure topic on the edge of physics that we're still doing work on, fusion, for example, and ask it to innovate or solve the fusion problem, it's not going to be able to do that, because basically the AI systems we have today, they're almost like a mirror in an interesting way of who we are and the collective knowledge that we've gotten up until this point. And it allows us to sort of query that collective knowledge, right? And hear renditions of that from all the voices that have contributed to that collective knowledge base. So to answer your question in short form, the way we train these systems to demonstrate that intelligence is through the data that we collectively have all participated in creating.
Yeah. We can talk more about this in Q&A. It's an extremely interesting topic. Unfortunately, for this session, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Mohammed, Dustin, Tian-An. Thank you so much for being here. Tonight, we've only scratched the surface of how AI is shaping the future of information and democracy. As the 2024 elections approach, it's more important than ever to stay informed, ask questions, and seek the truth. Continue the conversation and join our live Q&A right now on the WKAR News YouTube channel. And continue to follow along with the WKAR through the election season for information you can trust. From all of us here in the WKAR studios, thank you for watching.
WKAR is supported by the MSU Research Foundation, bringing new innovations to the marketplace for global impact. Learn more at msufoundation.org.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this online Q&A as part of WKAR's special Decoding Disinformation, AI and the Threat to Democracy. I'm your host, Sean Turner. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank MSU Research Foundation for their support of this production. Now, we're welcoming back to the stage Tien An Wong, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at the University of Michigan Dearborn, Mike Wilkinson, Data Reporter with Bridge, Michigan, Dr. Maria Molina, Assistant Professor of Advertising and Public Relations, and Dr. Mohammed Ghasemi, Assistant Professor of Computer Science. They'll be taking your questions on artificial intelligence and its impact on the spread of disinformation. You can submit those questions through the QR code that was on your screen or type them into the comments on YouTube. With that, let's get our first question. So I think where I'd like to start our discussion is by asking all of you to sort of think big. What do you think is the biggest opportunity that artificial intelligence presents? And Mohammed, we'll start with you.
I think there's a human opportunity, and then there is a kind of a manifestation of the technology as we understand it and have experienced it, but through it in a different modality. I'll be clear. Starting with the second. Right now, artificial intelligence tools have these really interesting, flexible capabilities vis-a-vis writing. It would be interesting if we could see a translation of some of that into flexible use in machines, right? That could help us with tasks. Think about, for example, that we have an aging population in the United States, and not just the United States, many parts of the world. And elder care is a thing that's hard to get lots of hands on deck to assist with. It'd be phenomenal if we had physical agents that could do flexible tasks, changing sheets on beds, helping people get to the restroom if they need to use it, and so on and so forth. So something that really excites me is seeing that crossing that sort of the virtual divide, if you will. Currently, we have a brain in a box. It'd be nice if that box is in a physical chassis of some kind so that it can perform certain things that are helpful for us beyond just writing essays and drafting documents and performing analytics. So for me, that's actually, I think, the most important part for the technical future of the tool. There's also something kind of an effect of the technology in the second order that I think is very exciting, which is as the technology makes it easier and easier to get tasks done quickly, it's going to sort of push us to kind of do the more human parts of our jobs and less of the machine parts. People don't like editing documents, right? That's not a fun part of the job that I do as a scientist, right? I like the creative part of the job. And so I think as the future kind of comes forward, I get really excited that we might be able to spend more time in discussions with colleagues and less time filling out forms and doing the things that we don't like. So these are the two things that at least excite me.
So really at the intersection of those synergies with human interaction. Yeah. Maria, what do you think?
So I think what excites me is this idea of being able to collaborate. So I think the human and AI have different capacities. So AI can be very quick, so it's very good at automation, right? But then humans, we have this ability to contextualize, to think through problems in a different way that AI does. So I do envision a future where we can actually collaborate with AI to actually come up with better solutions to problems that we might have. So even at a very basic level, right? Let's say all of us do research, we also have to do some teaching. There are a lot of things that AI is better at doing and automating, like for example, creating rubrics for our students, right? And in the meantime, while AI can do that for me, I can spend more time actually interacting with students, teaching students, right? So that human-AI collaboration can be translated in different ways across the different domains and roles that we all play in society.
And we'll continue, but I do want you all to think about, too, the next question I'm going to ask, because I'm going to ask whether or not you believe AI also contributes to making us lazy. And we'll talk about some examples of that. But Mike, what do you think with regard to sort of the greatest opportunity that AI presents?
So much of what we're talking about, we're all experiencing through the internet, right? And Google and the search engines have helped destroy my industry, journalism. Tens of thousands of fewer reporters are out there. This might be an opportunity to level up a little bit some of our reporting skills, and giving us an opportunity to cover more things. You know, our newsroom was created in part because so many newsrooms were decimated. That was the idea behind it. Maybe empowers the reporting team in Alpena or Escanaba or somewhere that they can get to more meetings. They can do more and inform the community about more that what is going on. They don't have to have a reporter in every single meeting. They can have someone read the video of it. I mean, to have AI read it and give them a summary, and then they can put it in Pinpoint, which I mentioned earlier, and they could maybe, wait a minute, they're all talking about the opioid settlement money. Why are they all talking about that? And right now, there might be only 1 or 2 reporters in those places, and they can't get to it. They can't be to those places like we used to when I was younger, when we had a reporter almost at every single meeting. So I think it's an opportunity to take away those automated jobs to an extent, but also actually empower our reporting and give us more opportunity to get it. And you know, the other part that is the ability to look at just huge data sets. You know, I mentioned that, you know, there was a reporting project about how many bombs were dropped in Gaza, right? Yeah. How do you get at that? Well, they trained, I think it was New York Times or some publication, trained AI to look at all the aerial photos and find every 40-foot diameter hole. And then they went back with the human and said, we found 2,200 of them. And okay, that's something. Whoa, there were 1,800 bombs. We could never have done that. I mean, it went against fate. Oh, we didn't miss anybody. Well, no, you did miss. You didn't hit all your targets. So that was only able by AI. And I think that's just one minor thing. And I think there are some great opportunities here. But there have to be some guardrails, because there's a lot of things that can go off the rails. I mean, just as easy as the internet kind of took away the advertising dollars, people could use this for profit and gain, as they already have, and that could just hurt us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Tian, what are your thoughts on the greatest opportunities that AI presents?
Yeah, I think similar to what was just said, I feel like, so I think first of all, I want to say I'm very skeptical about certain social ramifications or certain things, but within the realm of science itself, I think I'm pretty optimistic and excited about those things, because the way that, you know, I guess different AI systems where scientists are using it to sort of discover, you know, new relationships between different things, and sort of, for example, like discover new drugs or, you know, new ways of, you know, finding different ways of treatment, you know, and those sorts of things, especially in the healthcare sector. Those are pretty exciting, you know, in terms of the discoveries that could be made. But now, how those discoveries become monetized later, you know, who knows, you know.
Well, you mentioned that you're somewhat skeptical of the social implications. You know, we have a question here that asks whether or not AI will have a negative impact on our creativity, our critical thinking. And you know, I'll just see one example I think of is, you know, I was out with my daughter recently, and we were at a gas station, and on the shelf, covered in dust, was a book. And she looks at it and she says, "What's that?" And I say, "That's an atlas." In the old days, if we wanted to get from point A to point B, we had to actually use maps, which blew her mind. So when you think about the social implications of AI, creativity, you know, our ability to think critically, do you have concerns that we might be having, may have a negative impact? Maria, let's start with you.
So I have a yes and no in there. And the reason is, like, yes, of course, right? When we were talking about AI and training the AI, it's based on particular data that is there. So if you think about creativity in that sense, if I ask AI to do a piece of art, it will be based on the data that it has. But again, that's where I think the human and AI collaboration comes in handy. So I think the negative implications are always there for new technologies, but it is time to really understand that AI is here, right? So if we train in actually being able to use the AI to enhance our capacities and to be able to help us critically think while us using that creativity potential that we have, then it can really augment our capacities. But of course, if we just ask AI, you know what, give me an advertising for X company, it's going to do it based on the content that it has. So something that I try to tell my students is the strategy is on you. You are the creative. So if you want something innovative, then you have to work with the AI to make that happen, not just let it do whatever it wants and just have it create everything for you.
Yeah.
Well, that's my biggest fear is, you know, either as someone who sometimes codes or creates, if people rely on AI and it just keeps reading the AI that it created, and the end of creativity kind of ends. But I think there's going to be this human capacity and human desire and hunger to continue to be creative. One thing that is kind of concerning is there's a lot of websites that have, for justifiable reasons, cut themselves off from the language models, I think. And so that, are they going to discover the new things that, the JavaScript or the R code, whatever it is that helped me today? If it can't find the next thing, I'm going to get stagnant. And there's so much creativity in advancing. I'm afraid there's a potential for it just to stop. But we need to rely on people they're the creative engines. Is it a creative engine? I mean, or is it just repeating? I mean, I know you mentioned I think there's been some great work with amino acids and finding pairs that humans can't do the analytical, but is it creating?
Yeah.
I mean, it's creating maybe in the same way that we are, which is we have a base set of information from which we synthesize new ideas. So maybe in that sense, it's creating. I wanted to say the frontiers that are being pushed in artificial intelligence are going to change maybe the skill set that people are going to have to get good at. Just like, there was a time where if you wanted to be an accountant, perhaps you had to be very, very quick in doing addition, right?
Sure.
You had to be really quick at that. That was a skill that was necessary to be an accountant. And perhaps that's not a skill that was relevant after a calculator was invented. And the skill set of an accountant became, at least based on some of my colleagues at Deloitte, became more about being skeptical of the records and trying to do one level above that in critical thinking about it. And it sounds like there's a parallel, based on what you said, where maybe now when you're trying to think about art, or maybe some of the specific stylistic elements you don't have to master anymore. I don't have to know how to be a classical painter, but I have to know what should be painted and what image I want to evoke, right, and so on and so forth. And so I think that the skill set is going to change. What we have to be good at might change, but there's always going to be, the human still has to provide an input to this system. The human has to tell it to count the holes in the images you brought in.
Raise the question.
Raise the question, right? I mean, the AI was not going to raise the question on its own, right? And so in this very interesting way, it democratizes our ability to, or maybe levels the playing field, I should say, in this domain of ideas. Because before, the only people who could create content were those who had a bunch of animators and a bunch of editors and a bunch of, a marketing team and this and that. Well, now anybody can do it, right? And so it's much more a competitive, a level playing field, kind of at the idea stage. So I think there's something exciting about that, but you're making, I think, a fair point that some skills are going to erode as a consequence of that.
Well, you talked about this sort of human interaction. There's a question here that where someone says, look, they don't take issue with artificial intelligence and its prevalence and all the things it can do, but what they want is they always want to know when they are engaging with artificial intelligence. And the idea is that is a right. So do you think that, first of all, is that a fair desire, and how do we know when we're engaging with artificial intelligence? And should that be something that we should expect going forward?
Well, I think it's absolutely a fair fear. I want a desire to know. I mean, we have fact checkers that are built by AI that will tell you if a photograph is an AI-generated image. And I was just showing it to my colleagues a week and a half ago. And then someone said, try this one. And it turned out the photo was AI, but it was so good, the AI detector couldn't detect it. Now, the danger there is if someone put that into a news story and said, this loving couple said this, and it was a made-up quote, it would give authenticity to the news. And I mean, that's the scary part of disinformation in my regard. Because sometimes, yes, you can see the 3 fingers, the 6 fingers. The students all knew the tells, thankfully. The one eyebrow that's a little crazy. But it's getting so much better now that I think, I don't know
if it's going to be the government that has to put the watermark or require it. But this is an area where that desire to have that knowledge, I think, is paramount.
In our research also shows that, right? So we've done a lot of research where we look at transparency. So what do people think whenever they don't have the transparency versus having the transparency? And we see over and over again that content is actually perceived better when they know it's about AI, when AI has been creating that particular content. Now, for some type of context, people prefer human, indeed, but just the fact of having that transparency alone just makes people feel better about it. So I think at the very least, we owe the public to let them know whether we're using it and also in what capacity we're using it, right? So in news, for instance, it's very different to use it for editing versus some more major reporting or whatnot. So even at that capacity, I think it's an interesting way to just give public that perception of authenticity back.
Yeah, there's a conversation in my business where we have to always declare how it is being used. At the bottom, the store, AI was used to help summarize some paragraphs. It was at a helped copy and there's a movement to that level of transparency. It's not going to be legislated, but I mean, the major news organizations are almost all of them adopting an AI policy and making sure the reader does know.
Tian, there are a lot of qualifiers that are being associated with artificial intelligence, and one of them I've heard recently is socially responsible artificial intelligence. So we have a question here where a viewer is asking, what are some of the issues around bias and fairness as it relates to police surveillance and artificial intelligence that you've dealt with?
Well, it's interesting because, so I think as we're talking about what we think AI is, so a lot of what AI is pattern recognition, right? So when we're trying to, for example, train a model to do anything, it's sort of learning from historical data and sort of trying to predict future events. So anything that comes with bias, a lot of it actually just comes from human bias. So it's sort of learning, whatever human bias that already was baked into whatever historical incidents or events or data that's being fed into this model that's learning the thing that you're trying to make it do. So what's really interesting to me actually as a practitioner is that sometimes when we fight about things being biased, it's funny because if you train a model to learn human behavior, it actually learns the bias, and it's easier to see the bias in the model itself than to see the bias in humans. So.
Yeah. So we got a question here that I think is interesting. We all consume news and information on a regular basis, and when we think about the power of artificial intelligence, you're watching someone and what they're saying, you don't know if it's true or not. Artificial intelligence has the ability to fact check in real time. Do we think that that is an appropriate application of artificial intelligence, particularly as we think about information heading into the election?
I think it is, but there's always the meta question of who watches the watchman, right? Who checks the fact checker, right? And so, maybe at the first order, having AI check claims from other AI systems then begs the question of how the AI system that did the checking, how it did the checking right? And so that's not a pessimistic claim, but more just a realistic claim that, I don't think that the existence of AI fact-checking systems will solve the problem that's being brought up.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, right? That there isn't just a black and white true or false, right? So you can't just fact check something to say this is true or false. Sometimes there's satire, sometimes there's, it's fiction, sometimes it's, who knows?
Or omissions, right? There's lots of statements that are true technically, but in spirit are a lie, right? If you're reporting, let's say, on a conflict in some part of the world between two groups, right? You could subtly choose adjectives and adverbs to demonize one group and make one of the groups look better, right? Just depending on what you want to do. And it doesn't change the truth of the statement in explicit terms, right? But that framing, the choice of these subtle things like the adjectives and the adverbs, could change the way people emotively read and connect to the audience. So there's layers to what it means for the information to be true, right? Is it true technically? Maybe you can catch that. Is it true in spirit, right? Is it Is there a second order attempt to deceive people? I think that's a little harder to catch.
And even the fact, right? So I mentioned earlier, like, in the information ecosystem, we have so much types of information, it's tricky. But then I also think the real-time fact-checking, like, the models have data until a particular time. So if something happens right now, how do we fact-check that with AI? Like, we need the human to be able to do that at that level. So.
Well, we talked about the crowd sizes. I think Don Gagne talked about it at that event. And there's an AI tool that, the reporters who were there, if they knew the dimensions and they could have walked it off, there's a tool you could have gone to, and they said, okay, I think there were people standing, 2 every square meter. Oh, there was 10,000 people there. You could calculate. AI could have helped you calculate it. But there are so many people who just wanted to believe that it was all fake. So I mean, that's and wanted to believe the idea that it was AI generated. So even if we have these tools, there's so many people who just don't even care about the fact checking, because fact checking has become partisan to an extent.
So I have to. This is reminding me of something really interesting that happened when I was working at Thomson Reuters for a while. They had a conundrum where, obviously, before they wanted to release news, and this is before LLMs, right? So this is 8-9 years ago. They had a conundrum where, when they wanted to release news, they obviously don't want to release something that's fake, and so we had helped build algorithms that would do fake news detection, checking to make sure things were correct. And one of the greatest predictors, the greatest sort of indicators about whether information was true or not, was whether people who had nothing to kind of gain or lose by the truth or falsehood of the information, whether those people were independently validating it through tweets, is what they were looking at, for example.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's just to kind of agree very much with what's being said by my colleagues here, that human beings have a role to play in this.
And then they got around that by having all the bots approve them as tweets, and then they kind of made it look like it was real, and it really still was AstroTurf.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this aspect of sort of human beings and interactions. Some innovations are such that they tend to bring everyone along with them, because they come along and there's a slower implementation. But artificial intelligence is evolving and growing at such a pace that there are many in our society who feel left behind. It seems intimidating. It's big and complex and confusing. So I want you all to comment on that, and just the idea that it doesn't have to be, and hopefully tonight we demystified it a little bit. But what are your thoughts on whether artificial intelligence is sort of leaving part of our society behind?
I have the opinion that it is, and it needs to be corrected. So we did a study in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Very simple study. Here's what we did. We took a set of questions that showed up in high school textbooks about a variety of topics: math, geography, chemistry, biology, and so on. We asked these questions in English, and then we took those questions and we translated them to the 10 most widely spoken indigenous African languages, and just asked the exact same questions in those languages. No changes. And we validated these with 4 translators and so on and so forth to make sure everything was very buttoned up. The LLMs that exist now, the performance drops by sometimes up to 20% just by moving it from language A to language B. Now think about that for a minute, right? I was born as a person in an English-speaking country, so I can go and use a large language model and get answers that are right 20% more often than a person who speaks Amharic or a person who speaks Swahili. Or, say what you want about large language models or AI, it's useful. That's why we're having this conversation up on the stage, because it's undeniably useful. And that differential does exist because, given that they're trained on the basis of data, and not all languages and cultures and nations are creating that data at the same pace, it's worse in some languages than others. So we run a risk, I think, of a rich gets richer problem and a poor gets poorer problem, where language models in English get better because people can use them to create better content, and language models in other
But then also, like, you are absolutely right in terms of like the dimensionality of language and different cultures. But even within English-speaking countries, right? Let's look at digital divide. I think AI is free, right? We can all use it, but in reality, who is using it? What schools are teaching students to utilize this system? So for instance, I teach special topics here in AI, and I see that difference between students that come to the class. Some of them, they've been using it, they're so good at it, and some of them are still have even that fear of starting to use it. And so if we don't bring this to that stage to everyone in the classrooms, in even like within the elementary or high school system, then there's going to be a lot of people that are left behind. And that digital divide is going to be wider instead of shrinking, which actually I think AI has that capacity. So we have all this data in there that could be used to teach a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to receive higher education.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to the dystopia?
Absolutely, please.
So you have these people who are sort of left behind by the AI you're talking about, but there's also the people who have to serve the AI in the sense that we on Google there's a CAPTCHA and all these things where you have to like prove you're not a robot, but we're actually labeling data for training these models, right? And so, but it's actually people who get paid to do these things, and there's lots of people both here in the U.S. and in India, the Philippines, and all throughout Africa actually, and they're all just labeling data. So these are people who are just doing all these things, and all these other data centers, and there's all this labor that's really built to make AI work.
Yeah.
So it's not something we call it the cloud, but it's actually a very physical thing, and it eats a lot of energy.
There is so much more we could say about this topic. We could stay here all night talking about it, but we're out of time. Mohammed, Maria, Mike, Tian-An, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. Very informative conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you again to my panelists for being part of such an important conversation.